Coventry Climax won 4 Formula One World Championships in 7 years, and the chances are you've never heard the name. It was the engine behind Stirling Moss, Jack Brabham and Jim Clark, built not in a racing laboratory, but in a Coventry works where the same hands that finished fire pumps finished Grand Prix V8s. At its peak, 1,100 workers made engines, forklifts and military diesels from a single factory on Widdrington Road. They survived the Coventry Blitz, survived the collapse of their customers in the 1930s, survived a wartime evacuation and a peacetime pivot that remade the company from scratch. And then, after more than a century in the city whose name they carried, the works fell silent. How does a factory that won the World Championship simply disappear? What happened at Widdrington Road? Chapter 1. The Architect's Son. The story begins, as so many British industrial stories do, with a man whose ambition outran his capital. In 1903, at premises on East Street in Coventry, the city that by the turn of the century had become Britain's Detroit, a 26-year-old Boer War veteran named Horace Pelham Lee went into the engine business. He'd been born in Putney, southwest London, on 19th April 1877, the youngest child of Sidney Williams Lee, an architect, and Letitia Frances Withall. Nothing in that background pointed towards piston engines, but Lee had been educated at Bradfield College in Berkshire, trained as a pupil engineer at W. H. Allen, Sons & Co. in Bedford, and served in South Africa with the 3rd Troop of the 37th 38th Royal Buckinghamshire Hussars. When he came home, he completed his engineering apprenticeship not at some quiet provincial workshop, but at the Daimler Company in Coventry, right at the nerve centre of Britain's emerging motor industry. By the time he took those East Street premises, Lee knew engines. What he didn't have was the money to build complete motor cars. His partner was a Dane named Jens Stroyer, and the firm they registered, Lee Stroyer, built a handful of cars before the mathematics of the thing made the position clear. The capital required for motor manufacturing was more than was available, as the autocar's obituary of Lee would record half a century later with characteristic British understatement. The two men retreated to what their money could actually cover: piston engines, sold to anyone who'd buy them. Stroyer departed in 1905. Lee moved the works to Paynes Lane and renamed the venture Coventry Simplex, a name that paired the city with the engineering virtue of mechanical simplicity. It was a supplier's name, not a mark. No customer would ever ask for a Coventry Simplex by name across a showroom counter. But it was honest, and it worked. The early customer list reads like a roll call of Edwardian motoring optimism, firms whose names would blaze briefly and disappear. GWK of Maidenhead fitted over 1,000 Coventry Simplex 2-cylinder engines into its friction drive light cars between 1911 and 1915. Abbey, AJS, Albatross, Bayliss Thomas, Kleino, Crouch, Morendaz, Morgan. The engines flowed out of Lee's works to a parade of small marquets, each one convinced it was building the future of British motoring. But the customer who tells you most about the quality of a Coventry Simplex engine isn't a car maker at all. In 1913, a young enthusiast named Lionel Martin took a Coventry Simplex unit, mated it to a second-hand 1908 Isotta Fraschini chassis, and drove it up the Aston Clinton hill climb in Buckinghamshire. The car that resulted, the prototype, carried the name he gave it, Aston Martin. One of the most celebrated marques in motoring history started life with a Coventry engine under its bonnet, and then, a year later, an even more improbable customer. In 1914, Sir Ernest Shackleton ordered 4 Coventry Simplex vertical twin engines for the motorised snow tractors of his Imperial Transantarctic expedition, the expedition that would become one of the great survival stories of the 20th century. Shackleton's engines were designed to haul supplies across Antarctic ice. They were built in Coventry by the son of a Putney architect who'd come home from the Boer War with nothing but an engineering apprenticeship and a talent for making things that worked. The First World War interrupted everything. Lee's works turned to searchlight generating sets, hundreds of them, and in 1917 the company was renamed Coventry Climax, a private incorporation as Johnson & Smith Ltd, preparing the ground for the post-war reorganisation. In 1919, Pelham Lee acquired Johnson & Smith outright, rechristened it Coventry Climax Engines Ltd, and settled into the identity the firm would carry for the rest of its life. He was quietly authoritative, motorsport mad, photographed in later years at the wheel of a restored 1911 GWK light car, and methodical. Elected an associate member of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers in 1905, full member in 1924, he travelled regularly overseas on company business into his 70s. He handed effective control to his son, Leonard Pelham Lee, in the late 1930s, but remained chairman until his death in January 1953, at the age of 75. By then, the company he'd founded in a rented workshop had been making engines for half a century. It had another decade of glory ahead of it, and 3 decades of slow corporate suffocation after that. But in 1919, none of that was visible. What was visible was Coventry, already home to Daimler, Rover, Singer, Standard, Hillman, Riley, Triumph and Alvis, and a modest engine maker with good customers and a sensible name. Chapter 2. The Godiva Pump. Through the 1920s and into the early 1930s, Coventry Climax was busy but anonymous. Engines left the Friars Road works at a peak rate of 400 a week, flowing to small marques, Abbey, Crossley, Swift, Standard, Triumph, and to bus builders like Carrier and Guildford, and from 1935 to David Brown Tractors, in collaboration with Harry Ferguson. The firm was a Tier 1 supplier, invisible to the public, essential to dozens of manufacturers who couldn't afford to design their own power units. That invisibility nearly killed it. The 1929 crash and the rationalisation of the British motor industry obliterated Lee's customer base one name at a time. Swift of Coventry, some of whose last cars had carried William Lyons's Swallow coachwork alongside Coventry Climax engines, a detail that would echo 3 decades later. Closed in 1931. Kleino had gone in 1929. GWK had already stopped. Each closure left Lee with a stockpile of engines and no one to sell them to. What happened next was not strategy, it was survival. Leonard Pelham Lee, Horace's son, now running the daily operations, took the unsold 4-cylinder engines and converted them to drive electric generators. From generators, he made the leap into water pumping equipment. And from water pumping equipment, in the mid-1930s, came the instrument that saved the company, a 4-cylinder Coventry Climax engine bolted onto a centrifugal water pump, mounted on a trailer, and christened Godiva, after a steam fire pump that the Coventry Fire Brigade had operated since 1889. By 1937, with war clearly coming, the British government was buying the FF trailer pump in quantity. The auxiliary fire service needed thousands of portable pumping units, and Coventry Climax, a firm that had pivoted from car engines to fire pumps out of pure desperation, was suddenly a defence contractor. The green-painted trailer pumps that would be known to a generation of British children as the Green Goddess were Coventry Climax machines, built at a new works the firm had acquired in the late 1930s. That works was on Widdrington Road, in the Radford district of Coventry, and it came with a curious motoring pedigree of its own. Its earliest tenant had been the British Duryea Company, the Coventry venture of the American automobile pioneer Charles Duryea, managed by Henry Sturmey, the founder-editor of the Autocar and one of the original directors of Daimler in nearby Sandy Lane. Riley had occupied the premises after Duryea. Now Coventry Climax moved in, and it would stay at Widdrington Road for the next half-century, through World Championship glory and corporate decline and eventual receivership, until the factory gates closed for the last time. They'd barely finished settling in when the Luftwaffe arrived. On the night of 14th of November 1940, the Coventry Blitz destroyed 3/4 of the city's factories and 4,330 homes. The cathedral burned. The city centre was gutted. Widdrington Road was bombed. Coventry Climax evacuated its operations to Oswestry in Shropshire and carried on making fire pumps for the duration. And here sits one of the war's small, bitter ironies. On the morning after the raid, in the smoking, drizzle-soaked wreckage of Coventry city centre, with the cathedral still smouldering and the rubble of 1,000 homes choking the streets, exhausted auxiliary fire service crews were photographed hand-pumping Coventry Climax trailer fire pumps, fighting to save what was left of the city that had built them. The press photograph that survives captures it in a single frame. A lone rescue worker, hunched over a pump amid the shroud of smoke and rain, working a machine that had been manufactured 1.5 miles from where he was standing, in a factory that had itself been hit that same night. The same engine, the same city, the same night. After the war, Coventry Climax returned to Widdrington Road and added 2 other Coventry sites: Sandy Lane, part of the old Daimler complex, and later, in the 1960s, offices at Broadgate House in the rebuilt city centre. The firm was no longer just a fire pump maker. In 1946, Leonard Lee sent 8 Coventry Climax men across the Atlantic to study American forklift manufacture, and before the year was out, they'd built the first British forklift, the ET-199, a 4,000-pound capacity machine with a 24-inch load centre and a 9-foot lift. The refined production model, the FTD, won Ministry of Supply trials against American competition in 1947, and the forklift business became Coventry Climax's bread and butter: solid, profitable, exportable. E.g. for trucks were photographed handling potato crisps at the Golden Wonder factory in Corby, paper reels at the Birmingham Post and Mail, and dock work at LP gas-equipped operations in Denmark. The forklifts paid the bills. The fire pumps satisfied the government, and none of it hinted at what was about to happen next, because what happened next was an accident. Chapter 3. The Featherweight. In 1950, against the background of the Korean War, the Ministry of Defence rewrote its specification for the Army's portable fire pump. The new requirement was ambitious: 35 brake horsepower at 3,500 RPM, double the water delivery of the existing design, and half the weight. Leonard Lee looked at the specification and did what his father would have done. He went out and found the 2 finest engine designers in Britain: Walter Thomas Frederick Hassan. Wally, to everyone who worked with him, had started at Bentley Motors aged 15, employee number 14, in an era when the name Bentley still meant a man with oil on his hands and a car he'd built himself. Hassan became Wolf Bonato's personal mechanic at Brooklands, designed the famous Bonato-Hassan special, worked at ERA under Raymond Mays, and helped John Cobb to 2 land speed records. In 1938, he'd joined SS Cars in Coventry, the firm that would become Jaguar, where, with Chief Engineer William Haynes, he laid the groundwork for the XK engine that would power the Le Mans-winning C-Type and D-Type. Hassan knew more about high-performance engines than almost any man alive. He was 45 years old when Leonard Lee recruited him. Harry Mundy was younger, born in Coventry in 1915, educated at King Henry VIII School, apprenticed at Alvis, a draftsman for ERA, a designer for BRM's troubled V16. Where Hassan was the practical man, the hands-in-the-metal builder, Mundy was the conceptual designer, the man who could see an engine in his head before it existed on paper. Together, with a third engineer named Claude Bailey, they formed a design office without rival in Britain. Working from Hassan's study of motorcycle practice, particularly the wedge combustion chambers and overhead camshaft of the Sunbeam S7, they produced, in just 7 months, the engine that would change everything. The 1020cc FW, featherweight, was an aluminium block, alloy head, single overhead cam inline 4-cylinder. It ran first time in April 1951, produced 38 brake horsepower at 3,500 RPM, and weighed only 180 pounds. That's 20 pounds less than a Volkswagen Beetle's Flat 4. The complete portable fire pump unit, frame and all, came in at the Ministry's £350 maximum. The Home Office signed a contract for 5,000 engines. A fire pump engine. That's all it was. A light, efficient, beautifully designed piece of civil defence equipment, built to Ministry specification in a Coventry forklift factory. And then it went to the motor show. It was on the stand at Earl's Court in London that the FW collided with motorsport. Cyril Kieft, the Welsh sports car constructor whose Formula 3 driver was a young Stirling Moss, saw the engine and immediately understood what that power-to-weight ratio meant on a circuit. Colin Chapman, then building Lotus Specials in a Hornsey lockup, years away from the empire he'd create, badgered Leonard Lee with the same proposition. The message from both men was identical: race this engine. In 1953, Hassan, Mundy and the team rebored the FW block, fitted twin SU carburetors, a steel crankshaft and new pistons, and produced the 1098cc FWA, featherweight automotive, 72 brake horsepower at 6,100 RPM. A Coventry Climax engine had nearly doubled its output simply by being asked to. The FWA debuted at the 24 Hours of Le Mans in June 1954 in the nose of a Kieft 1100 sports racer. The car retired with a broken rear axle, but by season's end, Climax-engined cars were winning everything in the 1100cc class. The 1.5-litre FWB followed, then the FPF, a dedicated twin overhead cam racing four-cylinder developed, remarkably, as half of a stillborn 2.5-litre V8 that Leonard Lee had commissioned in 1954, codenamed Godiva, to preserve secrecy. The designation was FPE, and here is where the story takes a turn that still haunts motor racing historians. The FPE V8 was withdrawn before it ever raced. Leonard Lee, hearing rumours of the power Mercedes-Benz would bring to Formula One in 1955, lost his nerve. He believed the Coventry engine couldn't compete, but on the Widdrington Road dynamometer, the same dyno, in the same building, the FPE produced 264 brake horsepower. A works Maserati Formula One engine, borrowed from John Cooper for comparison, made 225. The Coventry engine was 39 horsepower ahead of a frontline Grand Prix rival, and it never turned a wheel in anger. It would have won. Lee's caution delayed Coventry Climax's arrival in Formula One by 3 years, but when they arrived with a weapon. On 19th January 1958, in Buenos Aires, Stirling Moss took the privately entered Cooper T43 of Rob Walker to victory in the Argentine Grand Prix. The engine in the back, a 1.96-litre version of the FPF, made it the first Grand Prix victory for a rear-engined car in the modern era. The rear-engined revolution had begun, and the engine that started it had been developed from a fire pump unit, designed to Ministry of Defence specifications, built at a forklift factory on Widdrington Road, Coventry. The same block, the same foundry, the same men. Chapter 4. The Widdrington Road Engine. By 1959, Formula One was a Coventry Climax championship. The 2.5-litre FPF, fitted to the back of John Cooper's lightweight T51, carried the Australian Jack Brabham to the World Championship of Drivers. Cooper Climax won the Constructors' Championship too. In 1960, Brabham did it again. 5 consecutive Grands Prix in the middle of the season in the now 2,497cc FPF, a dominance so complete that the only non-Coventry Climax victories that year were Stirling Moss's win at Monaco, also Climax-engined, in a Lotus, and Phil Hill's Ferrari win at Monza, which the British teams boycotted because of the banked circuit. 8 of Cooper's 1959 wins came from a Widdrington Road engine. All but 2 of 1960's championship victories were Climax-powered. 2 consecutive world titles delivered from a fire pump company in the West Midlands. The new 1.5-litre formula arrived in 1961, and Coventry Climax responded with the FWMV, a 90-degree V8 derived, with typical Widdrington Road pragmatism, from the FWM marine engine. It first ran in May 1961, debuted in the back of a Cooper T58 at the German Grand Prix that August, producing 181 brake horsepower at 8,500 RPM, and was developed over 7 marques across 4 racing seasons. The Mark III of 1963, with Lucas fuel injection replacing the Weber carburetors and a flat plane crank, reached 195 brake horsepower at 9,500 RPM. The final Mark VI 4-valver of 1965 produced 212 brake horsepower at 10,300 RPM, the equal of any 8-cylinder in the field and superior to the Ferrari and Honda V12s for most of the season. What those numbers don't convey is the feel of the place that produced them. Widdrington Road in the early 1960s was not a gleaming motorsport facility. It was a Coventry engineering works that happened to make the best racing engines in the world. A forklift instructor who visited in the early 1980s, by which time nothing had changed, described the factory as Victorian. Overhead, belt-driven machinery ran the fire pump department and the forklift department, identical to the power transmission you'd have found in a textile mill 50 years earlier. The company employed a huge number of staff, partly because the machinery required it. There were no computer-controlled lathes, no clean rooms, no research campus. There was a works floor, and there were men who knew what they were doing. The secret was the finishers, a body of inspectors who worked on every product the company made, from fire pumps to racing engines. They kept a stock of shims in every conceivable size. They hand-fitted, hand-polished, hand-measured. The same men who brought fire pump engines up to specification were the men who took those engines and finished them to the tolerances that Formula One demanded. The world-beating FWMV V8 came out of the same hand-finishing tradition that produced the Green Goddess trailer pump. The smells on the works floor were petrol, hot oil, machine coolant, and aluminium swarf. The sound, until the racing dynamometer was fired up, was the rhythmic clatter of overhead belt drives, the heartbeat of a Victorian workshop that had somehow learned to build engines capable of 10,000 on RPM. At the same time, the commercial side was thriving. Coventry Climax forklifts, Climax trucks, Climax conveyances, Climax shore loaders were moving goods across Britain and beyond. The Armstrong Whitworth H30 supercharged multi-fuel diesel engine, developed at Widdrington Road, went into military service as the auxiliary power unit in the Chieftain and Challenger battle tanks and the Rapier missile system. The Roots Group commissioned a mass production version of the FWMA engine, the all-aluminium overhead cam unit that would power the Hillman Imp. By the time the Imp ceased production in March 1976, 440,032 units had been built. More engines left British showrooms under the Climax-derived Imp badge than ever left any racing constructor's factory, and at Le Mans, the Lotus Elite, Colin Chapman's fiberglass Grand Tourer, powered by a Coventry Climax FWE engine, took 6 consecutive class wins between 1959 and 1964, an unbroken streak that the Lotus Elite World Register records with justified pride. But the peak of everything, the racing, the forklifts, the fire pumps, the military engines, the Le Mans wins, the sheer breadth of what one Coventry works could do, came in a single season and a single car. In 1963, Colin Chapman's Lotus 25, the first fully stressed monocoque chassis in Formula One history, carried the marked third FWMV V8 and a Scottish farmer's son named Jim Clark. The season that followed is still cited as one of the most crushing in the sport's history. Clark won 7 of the 10 World Championship rounds: Belgium, Holland, France, Britain, Italy, Mexico and South Africa, and was classified in all 10, scoring the maximum 54 points. He won the title again in 1965 in the Lotus 33 with the Mark VI 4-valve FWMV. 19 of Jim Clark's 25 Grand Prix victories were in Coventry Climax-powered cars. Between 1958 and 1965, Coventry Climax engines won 40 Grands Prix and 4 World Championships. For Cooper, Lotus, Brabham, Rob Walker, Yeoman Credit, and others, the FWMV V8 alone won 22 of those races, 40 Grands Prix, 4 world titles, from a factory whose belt-driven machinery hadn't changed since the Edwardian era, whose finishers worked by hand and by eye, and whose canteens served the racing engine men and the forklift assemblers from the same counter. Chapter 5. The Dewar Trophy. In May 1964, the Royal Automobile Club awarded its Dewar Trophy, the highest engineering honour in British motoring, to Leonard Pelham Lee for the design, development and production of engines which have brought British cars to the forefront in the field of Grand Prix racing. The last previous recipient had been Alec Issigonis for the Mini in 1959, and Issigonis himself had been a junior engineer at Coventry Climax earlier in his career, one of several quiet connections between Widdrington Road and the broader story of British engineering in the 20th century. Leonard Lee was now at the summit of his industry. The Dewar Trophy was the establishment's acknowledgement that a Coventry forklift and fire pump company had, through the brilliance of its engineers and the quiet stubbornness of its management, produced the dominant racing engine of its era. The firm had 1,100 employees. Its product line spanned Grand Prix engines, forklift trucks, marine diesels, fire pumps, generator sets and military auxiliary power units. It exported worldwide. It had won every major honour motor racing could offer. On 21st June 1966, His Royal Highness Prince Philip toured the Widdrington Road works, photographed in front of a flat 16 FWMW test engine, the stillborn successor to the FWMV V8, a machine that had produced only 209 brake horsepower on test and suffered crippling oil and torsional vibration problems. The flat 16 never raced. It was the last new Formula One engine Coventry Climax would ever build. Harry Mundy, by then, had moved on to another commission that reveals both his genius and his temperament. Colin Chapman asked him to design the twin-cam cylinder head for the Lotus engine that would go into the Cortina and the Elan. Mundy agreed, and took a lump sum fee of £1,000 rather than a royalty of £1 per engine. It was a practical man's decision, made at a time when nobody knew how many engines Lotus would build. In the end, 34,000 twin-cam engines were made. Mundy had turned down £34,000, over £1 million in today's money, for the certainty of a cheque he could bank immediately. But the Prince Philip visit, the Dewar Trophy, the championship-winning engines still on the dynamometer, all of it was already taking place inside a company that had been sold, and the man who'd bought it had his eye not on Formula One, but on a V12. The peak and the beginning of the end were the same moment. By the time Prince Philip walked through those factory gates, Coventry Climax had been a Jaguar subsidiary for 3 years. The racing programme was running on borrowed time. The engineers who'd built the most successful Grand Prix engine in British history were already being drawn into a project that had nothing to do with motor racing. And out in the wider world, a sequence of mergers and government interventions was beginning that would, within 15 years, reduce the company that won 4 world championships to a subdivision of a failing nationalised conglomerate, managed by men who had never set foot on the Widdrington Road works floor and did not know what they owned. Chapter 6. The Jaguar deal. The deal was announced on 16th of March 1963, the same year Jim Clark won 7 of 10 Grands Prix in a Coventry Climax-powered Lotus 25. While the engine was winning everything on the circuit, the company that built it was being sold. Sir William Lyons, the Jaguar chairman, would acquire Coventry Climax by share exchange, 10 Jaguar A ordinaries for every 7 Climax ordinaries. Leonard Lee and his colleagues held 75% of the shares between them and accepted immediately. Lyons told the press that an integration of the two companies could lead to great progress. Lee, more enthusiastically, "This is the greatest thing that has happened to us. I think it is a wonderful opportunity for us to develop far more quickly than would have otherwise been possible. I suppose it is a takeover, but I hope nobody takes the term in its worst sense." The strategic logic was straightforward, and it had nothing to do with Formula One. Lyons had been on an acquisition run. He'd bought Daimler in 1960, picked up Guy Motors out of liquidation in 1961, and would add Henry Meadows in 1965. What he needed was engineering depth, specifically the men and the patents to develop a V12 engine for the next generation of Jaguar saloons and a successor to the E-Type. Acquiring Coventry Climax brought back Walter Hassan, who had been a Jaguar man from 1938 to 1950 before Leonard Lee recruited him. It ultimately delivered Harry Mundy too. By 1968, Haynes, Hassan, Mundy and Bailey, arguably the 4 finest engine designers in Britain, were sitting under one roof developing what would become the Jaguar 5.3-litre V12 of 1971. The racing engine men were being redeployed to build a luxury car engine. It was, from Lyons' perspective, an efficient use of talent. From the perspective of anyone who cared about Coventry Climax as an independent entity, it was the beginning of the end. Jaguar publicly committed to continuity. The official statement read, "It is intended that the manufacture of existing products will continue as previously." They emphasized their intention of retaining the same management and said that Mr. Lee will remain as managing director of Climax. And initially, that was true. Leonard Lee stayed in his office. Hassan's research continued. The racing program even ran for 2 more seasons. But Lee's own logic for accepting the deal tells you everything about where the firm stood. Formula One was a cost that a publicly listed company with 1,100 employees and a forklift business to run could no longer justify. At the Earl's Court Motor Show in October 1962, 6 months before the Jaguar announcement, Leonard Lee had already told the press he intended to withdraw from Grand Prix racing. The decision was reversed only when the oil companies and the racing teams agreed a more economical pricing structure for the engines. The message was unambiguous. The glory didn't pay. The championships, the 40 Grand Prix victories, the Dewar Trophy, none of it generated the returns that justified the investment. Coventry Climax was a fire pump and forklift company that had accidentally conquered Formula One, and the accident was getting expensive. When the FIA introduced the 3-litre formula for 1966, Coventry Climax tried and failed with the FWMW Flat 16. The engine Prince Philip had been photographed with, the one that produced only 209 brake horsepower and suffered crippling oil surge and torsional vibration problems. The project was abandoned. Coventry Climax withdrew from Formula One at the end of the 1965 season. Lotus moved to the Ford Cosworth DFV. Brabham switched to Repco. Cooper turned to a Maserati V12. The FWMV team at Widdrington Road was disbanded, except for a handful kept on for the stopgap 2-litre version that powered Lotus in early 1966 and carried Jim Clark to the 1967 Tasman Series title. A 2.5-litre derivative of the Jaguar V12, the CFA, fitted experimentally to Leonard Lee's personal Triumph 2000 estate, was even prepared as a possible competition engine. But that project too was killed in 1968 to avoid internal competition within a corporate group that was about to get very much larger and very much more dysfunctional. For Walter Hassan, the Jaguar buyout was a homecoming. He'd worked at SS Cars before the war. The V12 project was the kind of engineering challenge he lived for, and his contribution to the 5.3-litre engine that debuted in the E-Type Series 3 is one of the finest pieces of British automotive engineering of the post-war era. He would retire on 28th April 1972, aged 67, with an OBE for services to the motor industry. But for the racing fitters and dynamometer engineers at Widdrington Road, the finishers who'd hand-polished FWMV components to tolerances that won world championships, the Jaguar deal was the end of their best years. No one at Jaguar cared about fire pump engines tuned to 10,000 RPM. No one at Jaguar needed a stock of shims in every conceivable size. The skills that had made Coventry Climax extraordinary were surplus to the requirements of a luxury car company. The finishers went back to finishing forklift components and fire pump engines, and the dynamometer that had once screamed with Formula 1 V8s fell quiet. Chapter 7. Swallowed. The decisions that destroyed Coventry Climax were not made at Widdrington Road. They were made in boardrooms in London and Whitehall by men whose names appear in the histories of British industrial decline as reliably as the names of the companies they dismantled. In 1966, Jaguar Cars merged with the British Motor Corporation, the makers of Austin, Morris and the Mini, to form British Motor Holdings. Sir William Lyons, who had built Jaguar from a Blackpool sidecar firm into one of the most admired car companies in the world, retained the chairmanship but lost effective control of his engineering department. He retired as managing director in late 1967, and his final years at the company were, by every account, a constant struggle against impossible odds to retain the identity and independence of Jaguar, not least its engineering department, the very department he'd acquired Coventry Climax to strengthen. Then, in 1968, came the merger that swallowed everything. Under encouragement from Tony Benn, then chairman of the Industrial Reorganisation Corporation in Harold Wilson's Labour government, British Motor Holdings merged with the Leyland Motor Corporation to form the British Leyland Motor Corporation under chairman Sir Donald Stokes. The new conglomerate contained in a single ungovernable structure virtually every British-owned motor manufacturer: Austin, Morris, MG, Wolseley, Riley, Jaguar, Daimler, Rover, Triumph, Land Rover, Leyland Trucks and Buses, and the constellation of acquired specialists that included Coventry Climax. It was the largest industrial merger in British history. It was also, as the following decade would demonstrate, the worst. In December 1971, British Leyland completed the transfer of Coventry Climax into its Special Products division. On that date, Leonard Pelham Lee stepped down as chairman and left the company his father had founded 68 years earlier. He was the last Lee at Widdrington Road. The departure is recorded in the company histories as a dry corporate fact, a reorganisation, a retirement, a transition. But consider what it meant. A man whose father had started making engines in a rented workshop on East Street in 1903, whose firm had survived the collapse of its customers in the 1930s, the Coventry Blitz, the post-war pivot from car engines to fire pumps, and the accidental glory of 4 Formula 1 World Championships. That man walked out of the gates of his own factory for the last time because a nationalised conglomerate had decided his company belonged in a filing cabinet labelled Special Products. From that day forward, Widdrington Road was managed by men who had no stake in the name above the door. The dismemberment accelerated. In the early 1970s, the fire pump business was separated entirely and sold back into private ownership as Godiva Fire Pumps, set up in Warwick under Charles Pelham Lee, Leonard's son, Horace's grandson. The Lee family was now out of Coventry Climax altogether and confined to a single product line in a different town. 3 generations of Lees, Horace, Leonard, Charles, and the only piece of the company any of them still controlled was the Godiva pump, the instrument of survival that had saved the firm in the 1930s. There is a symmetry to that, but it is not a comforting one. In April 1975, following the financial collapse of British Leyland, the Ryder Report, British Leyland, the Next Decade, was presented to the Wilson government by Sir Don Ryder, head of the newly created National Enterprise Board. The Labour government accepted Ryder's recommendation that BL be effectively nationalised through the creation of a new holding company, in which the state was the majority shareholder. 7 existing divisions were collapsed into 4. Leyland Cars, 128,000 employees. Leyland Truck and Bus, 31,000. Leyland International, 18,000. And Leyland Special Products, which incorporated Aveling Barford, Alvis, Self-Changing Gears, Nuffield Press, and under the subheading Materials Handling, Coventry Climax. Coventry Climax, with its sub-brands Climax Trucks, Climax Conveyancer, and Climax Shoreloader, was now a footnote in a footnote, a subdivision of one of 5 subdivisions of one of 4 divisions of a nationalised conglomerate that the Treasury would never give enough capital to modernise. The Widdrington Road Works, by every account still Victorian with its overhead belt-driven machinery, got no significant investment. The firm that had won the Jaguar trophy a decade earlier was now, on paper, in the same corporate family as the printers of British Leyland's own payslips. In 1977, Sir Michael Edwards, the South African-born industrialist plucked from chloride, was appointed chief executive by the National Enterprise Board. His mandate was to sell off everything that was not central to volume car production and to break the power of the shop stewards movement. Coventry Climax was on Edwards's hit list from the start. In the same year, BL had Coventry Climax acquire the Warrington forklift business of Rubery Owen Conveyancer, rebranded Climax Conveyancer, a final, unconvincing effort to consolidate the materials handling division before putting it on the market. At the end of 1978, BL formed a new umbrella called BL Commercial Vehicles, under managing director David Abel, combining Leyland Vehicles, Alvis, Self-Changing Gears, and Coventry Climax. The company that had won 4 Formula One World Championships and held the Royal Automobile Club's Jaguar Trophy was reorganised as a materials handling sub-subdivision within BLCV, alongside a small North Warwickshire transmissions firm and the printers of the group's own stationery. The brand that had powered the rear-engined revolution was now, on paper, a forklift maker reporting to David Abel, with no separate accounts and no separate identity. No one at Widdrington Road had chosen any of this. No one at Widdrington Road had been consulted. The men who'd hand-finished championship-winning engines and assembled forklift trucks on the same floor were simply informed, at each stage, that their employer's name had changed again and that they now reported to someone new. The overhead belt drives still turned. The fire pump engines still ran. The forklifts still shipped. But the name, Coventry Climax, meant nothing to the men in London and Whitehall who decided its fate. It was a line item, a disposal opportunity, a fringe operation to be sold. Chapter 8. The Chairman's Competitor. The disposal came as part of Edwards's December 1980 closures programme. On 16 December 1980, BL announced redundancies of 1,500 jobs at Coventry Engines, 900 at its body plant in Speke on Merseyside, and another 430 at Alford Alder Truck Axle Manufacturers in Hemel Hempstead. And, as part of the same announcement, BL would sell its loss-making Coventry Climax Forklift Truck Company to a group of private investors led by Sir Emmanuel Kay, chairman of Lansing Bagnall. The name bears repeating. Lansing Bagnall was Coventry Climax's chief competitor in the British forklift market. Emmanuel Kay, born Manek Kaganovich in Petrograd in 1914, naturalised British in 1933, was an industrial entrepreneur of formidable energy. He and a partner named John Sharp had bought the about-to-fail Lansing Bagnall in 1943 for a few £1,000s and built it into Britain's leading forklift manufacturer. By the early 1980s, Kay chaired Lansing Bagnall and a clutch of other enterprises. He acquired Coventry Climax in a separate vehicle, Coventry Climax Holdings Lee Ltd., ostensibly independent of his Lansing interests. Whether competition law was satisfied was always debated. What is not debated is what happened next. The deal closed formally in 1982. Coventry Climax was now privately owned by the chairman of its biggest rival, operating from the same Victorian works on Widdrington Road, with the same belt-driven machinery, the same hand-finishing tradition, the same workforce, but without the resources of even a failing nationalised conglomerate behind it. BL, for all its dysfunction, had at least been large. Coventry Climax Holdings was not. Within 4 years, the firm was insolvent. In October 1986, Coventry Climax was put into receivership. Motorsport magazine, in its November 1986 issue, recorded the news with quiet sadness. It is sad to report that Coventry Climax Ltd recently passed into the hands of a receiver. The company's contribution to the growth of British motor racing is incalculable, and we sincerely hope that it survives its present difficulties. It did not survive. The forklift business was acquired by Cronin Tubular. Swedish firm Kalmar Industries took over the forklift interests and traded for a few years as Kalmar Climax, before reverting to Kalmar Industries Ltd. The forklift name survived in Sweden, in Swedish ownership, with no connection to the works on Widdrington Road or the men who'd built them. In 1990, the engine business, the rump that still made the Armstrong-Whitworth H30 tank auxiliary, was sold to Horseman Defence Systems of Bath, Somerset. The transaction broke the link with Coventry. After 87 years, the company was no longer based in the city whose name it carried. The trade union response, so far as the record shows, was muted, but not because the unions didn't care. By 1986, the Coventry district of the Transport and General Workers Union was, in the words of a senior officer, constantly firefighting. All our officers spent all day negotiating with companies over redundancies and closures. At the same time, we have been hemorrhaging members at a tremendous rate. District membership fell from 47,500 to 34,000 across the decade. Grenville Hawley, the TGW's national automotive officer, dealt with BL disposals as they came, one after another, a conveyor belt of closures. Bill Lapworth, the Coventry district secretary, did what he could. A single forklift maker going into receivership was, by 1986, an unremarkable Coventry event. That is itself the most damning measure of what had happened to the city. Coventry Climax, the company that had won 4 Formula One World Championships and held the Royal Automobile Club's highest honour, went into receivership, and the city barely noticed. It was just one more factory, one more set of redundancies, in a decade that had already taken everything. Chapter 9. The Long Tail. The end didn't come cleanly. It never does with British industrial death. There's always a long tail, a diminishing sequence of office closures, production transfers, and small redundancies that stretches for years after the real death, like a heartbeat that continues after the patient is already gone. In December 2009, Kalmar moved its remaining Coventry Climax production from the city to Shrewsbury. The factory gates at Widdrington Road, the gates that Horace Pelham Lee had first walked through in the late 1930s, that Walter Hassan and Harry Mundy had walked through every morning in the 1950s, that Jim Clark's championship engines had been loaded through in crates, closed for the last time. Then, in 2014, Kalmar announced the closure of its remaining offices at Siskin Drive on the Middlemarch Business Park in Coventry. 22 administrative jobs would go, with staff facing compulsory redundancies by the end of the month. 3 management staff were given new positions within the organisation. 50 service engineers, organised from the Coventry office, were reported as safe for the time being. 22 redundancies, not 1,100, not the 400 who'd worked the forklift line. 22 office workers in a business park on the edge of the city, the last trace of a name that had once been stamped on the engines of every championship-winning racing car in the world. With that, Coventry Climax left Coventry forever. Chapter 10. Bishopsgate. The Widdrington Road Works was demolished. The site today, in the CV14 postcode area of Coventry, in the Radford ward of Coventry North West, is Bishopsgate Business Park, a development of single-storey steel portal-framed light industrial units, tenanted by small and medium enterprises, a wholesale electrical distributor, a vehicle MOT and service centre. The commercial agent's particulars describe it as you'd expect. The property is situated within Bishopsgate Business Park off Widdrington Road, which links to the A444 Foleshill Road, providing direct access to the M6 motorway and Coventry city centre. Where Jim Clark's championship V8s were balanced and dynamometer tested in 1963, today vans are MOT tested. Where the finishers kept their stocks of shims in every conceivable size, today someone sells electrical cable by the reel. The terraced streets around Widdrington Road, half a mile northwest of the city centre, are now mostly rented housing. The works hooter is silent. The belt drives are gone. The smells of petrol and hot oil and aluminium swarf have been replaced by the particular absence of smell that belongs to a steel shed estate with concrete floors and roller shutter doors. The forklift name survives in Sweden. Kalmar Industries builds handling equipment that owes nothing to Widdrington Road. The engine business survives in Bath. Horseman Defence Systems still makes the H-30 tank auxiliary, the last engineering product with a direct lineage to Hassan and Mundy's design office. The fire pump business survives in Warwick. Godiva Fire Pumps, the brand that saved the company in the 1930s, still operates under American ownership, sold to the US firm Hale Products in 1989 and to IDEX Corporation in 1994. Charles Pelham Lee's inheritance, still pumping water. The Coventry Climax trademark, UK registered trade, mark number 2527892, is the property of Peter Shermer of Chichester, West Sussex. Coventry Climax Engineering Ltd produces parts. Peacock Engineering of 65 Westow Street in London builds complete FWA blocks and engines for the vintage racing circuit. Climax-engined Coopers, Lotuses and Lolas race every year at Goodwood Revival and the Monaco Historic Grand Prix, their engines rebuilt and tuned to specifications that the Widdrington Road finishers would recognise immediately, because the men at Peacock learned from the same tradition, the same hand finishing, the same stock of shims. The Coventry Transport Museum, in the city centre, maintains a permanent display of Climax-engined racing cars and Climax engines in its motorsport gallery, including an FWMV V8 cutaway. The Jaguar Daimler Heritage Trust, now headquartered at the British Motor Museum at Gaydon, holds the company's primary archive, including the May 1968 case history booklet from which much of the Lee family narrative comes. The Modern Records Centre at the University of Warwick holds AUEW and TGWU branch papers covering Coventry Climax in the relevant decades. Oral histories of Walter Hassan and Leonard Pelham Lee are preserved in the Coventry University Richardson Tapes collection. The records survive. The engines survive. The name, in law, survives. But the thing itself, the working enterprise, the Widdrington Road works with its belt drives and its finishers, and its Formula One dynamometer and its forklift assembly line, and its 1,100 employees walking through the gates at the start of the morning shift. That is gone. Coventry's wider de-industrial trajectory is the context that makes this specific loss feel both singular and representative. Between 1975 and 1982, the 15 largest firms in the city shed a total of around 55,000 jobs. Alfred Herbert, once the world's largest machine tool maker, collapsed at the start of the 1980s. The Standard Triumph Canley works closed in August 1980. Massey Ferguson at Banner Lane and Peugeot at Ryton would follow. Coventry, which had spent the first 3/4 of the 20th century as Britain's motor city, spent the last quarter watching it all come down. Jerry Dammers, the keyboard player and songwriter of the Specials, grew up in Coventry and wrote the single Ghost Town about what the band saw touring British cities at the start of the 1980s. Released on 12th of June 1981, it reached number 1 on 5th of July and stayed there for 3 weeks. Dammers told The Guardian years later, "You travelled from town to town, and what was happening was terrible. It was clear that something was very, very wrong." He could have been describing the view from any street in Radford, including Widdrington Road, where the forklift company that had once won the World Championship was about to be sold off to its own competitor's chairman and put into receivership. Chapter 11. What Remains. One story from the archive of Coventry Climax survives that carries the weight of the whole. In 1914, a young man in Coventry, the son of a Putney architect, recently returned from South Africa, built 4 small engines for Sir Ernest Shackleton's Antarctic expedition. 60 years later, his grandson ran the fire pump company in Warwick that was the last piece of the family business. In between, the engines that left the workshop on Widdrington Road powered Stirling Moss's first Grand Prix victory, Jack Brabham's 2 world titles, And Jim Clark's extraordinary 1963 season, 7 wins from 10 races in a car whose engine had been developed from a portable fire pump designed to ministry specifications. The same block, the same foundry, the same tradition of hand finishing. From Shackleton's Antarctic to Clark's Spa-Francorchamps, from the Green Goddess trailer pump to the FWMV V8, screaming at 10,000 RPM on the Widdrington Road dyno, one unbroken line of Coventry engineering, built by men who understood that the gap between a good engine and a great one was measured in shims and patience and the accumulated knowledge of hands that had done the same work for decades. That line was not broken by a market failure. It was not broken by a technological revolution. It was not broken by foreign competition or by workers who couldn't adapt. It was broken by 3 signatures on 3 documents: the 1963 sale to Jaguar, the 1968 absorption into British Leyland, and the 1982 disposal to Sir Emmanuel Kay, each one made by men who believed they were acting reasonably, each one moving the work a little further from the hands that knew how to do it. Bishopsgate Business Park sits quietly on Widdrington Road. The steel sheds catch the Midlands rain. Vans queue for the MOT bay. The terraced streets of Radford carry on as they always have. Working streets, ordinary streets, streets that once heard the works hooter every morning and every evening, and hear it no longer. 106 years in Coventry, 4 World Championships, 40 Grands Prix, and the silence that followed has a physical weight, the kind you feel in a building that was designed for noise, built for work, and emptied of both.